A simple woman stepped into Terminal 3 of the International Airport just after sunrise. No entourage. No suitcase. Just a faded olive coat, loosely buttoned at the middle, a canvas tote slung over one shoulder, and a paper ticket held tight in her hand like a fragile letter from a long-lost friend. Nobody noticed her at first. And that was how she preferred it. She was not someone you'd stop to compliment. She didn't walk with elegance, didn't look hurried, didn't carry the confident ease of frequent travelers. She just existed. In between. But 7 minutes after she entered that terminal, the airline's central alert system would receive a notice. For internal teams would be quietly looped into a private communication thread. By the end of the day, 3 senior staff members would be removed from their positions, and a merger deal worth billions would come to a halt. All because of her. And yet, she never raised her voice. What happened between the moment she stepped into that terminal and the minute her name lit up red on a hidden executive dashboard is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about power, about prejudice, and about the price of assuming too little. So if you've ever wondered what justice sounds like when it whispers instead of screams, stay. This is the story you didn't know you needed. The woman's name, at least the one printed on the ticket, was Yem Rowe. No title. No initials of prestige. Just 3 soft letters that held 1,000 echoes. She stood in the pre-check line like everyone else, her body language a study in patience. Others shifted from foot to foot, glancing down at devices, adjusting bags, sighing loudly. She stood still. The stillness of someone who knew how long things took. The stillness of someone who'd waited through far more than lines. At the checkpoint, the security agent scanned her ticket, paused, then double-checked the name. Not because it raised alarms, but because it didn't. It was the kind of name so unassuming, so quiet, it almost asked to be forgotten. The agent looked up and hesitated, not in confusion but in subtle calculation. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. Just the pause, long enough to imply a silent question. Are you sure you're in the right place? Yem didn't answer questions that weren't spoken. Go ahead, the agent said finally, motioning her through. She passed the metal detector with ease. No alarms. No beeps. Still, she was pulled aside. Routine check, a second officer mumbled. They searched her tote. Inside, a hardbound leather folder tied with a thin red cord, a small cloth pouch, and a rolled-up scarf. The officer opened the folder and saw nothing that screamed importance, just fine paper, embossed edges, lines of text too small and orderly to catch attention. He closed it without reading. You're good, he said. But the glance he gave her as she stepped away said more, an unspoken dismissal. The kind that assumes no threat means no significance. She reached gate 42A 23 minutes before boarding. Most of the other passengers were clustered around charging stations or glued to their screens. Yem chose a seat near the window. The early morning light painted the glass with gentle streaks of gold. Outside, ground crews moved like shadows under floodlights. She didn't watch them. She wasn't here for spectacle. She was here for pattern. A toddler, barely walking, wobbled past her with outstretched arms and sticky hands. The child's mother, seated nearby, noticed her staring and gently steered the child in the opposite direction, as if proximity to a woman like her might somehow stain the baby's morning. She didn't react. She rarely did. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small notebook. Handwritten inside were only 6 lines. Observe how they look at you before reading your name. Notice who gets offered first. Mark who skips your row. Track every apology not given. Count how many times you must reprove what you've already shown. Remain calm. They won't expect that. She read it once, closed the book, and placed it back inside her coat. When the first boarding call came, priority and first-class passengers, she rose with quiet certainty. A man in a tailored suit glanced at her shoes, and then at her boarding pass. A gate agent with lacquered nails and a tight bun held out her hand. Sorry ma'am, first class only, the agent said. Yem handed her the ticket without speaking. The agent scanned it. The machine beeped once, clear and green. Seat 1A. The agent's mouth opened slightly, as if to say something more, but nothing came. She handed back the ticket and gestured with a stiff arm. Have a pleasant flight. Inside the jet bridge, the air shifted, cooler, more sterile, the kind that pretends to welcome while bracing to manage. She stepped onto the aircraft first. The flight attendant stationed at the front greeted her with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Welcome aboard, she said automatically, then glanced down the aisle behind Yem, as if hoping for someone more familiar. Seat 1A was by the window, aisle clear, overhead bin still open. Yem placed her tote carefully inside, then sat. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. From the outside, she looked entirely ordinary. But inside that tote, behind the ordinary appearance, was the document no one on that aircraft or in that airport had expected to be flying that day. It had been 3 years since she'd inherited it. A silent trust. A dormant asset activated only under one specific clause. An anonymous stakeholder shall personally assess equity integrity of participating merger parties via on-site observation prior to final release of signature authority. It was a clause buried under legal language, so dense even most lawyers skipped it. But she hadn't skipped anything. She had read every word. This morning, she had decided, today would be the test. The moment she sat down, something began to change. The flight attendant skipped her for the welcome drink tray. A bottle of sparkling water was handed to 1B, then to 2A. But not her. When the snack basket came, it swerved like a shadow around her seat. The same professional smile. The same polite detachment. Except it wasn't professional. It was filtered. It was measured. They weren't rude. They were strategic. Polite where it counted, dismissive where it wouldn't be questioned. Because people like her, women who looked like her, didn't make a scene. They were used to being overlooked. They were trained by life to walk under the radar. That's what they assumed. That's what they banked on. And that's where they miscalculated. Yem wasn't here to complain. She wasn't here to educate or confront. She wasn't even here to be respected. She was here to see, to note, to test, to verify. Every skipped offering, every unchecked assumption, every lowered voice and delayed smile would become data. They didn't know she was the final signatory on a deal that would redefine which routes their aircraft could fly and which executive bonuses would be unlocked next quarter. They didn't know her signature could stall an entire year's worth of projections. They didn't know because they didn't ask. And that's why this flight, this morning, this woman, was not just a passenger. She was the audit they didn't know was happening. A soft verdict waiting at 30,000 feet. Wrapped not in a badge or a clipboard or a VIP tag, but in silence. And silence, in the right hands, is never powerless. The wheels of the plane had barely left the tarmac when it began. Not with a bang. Not with some overt slight. But with a look, barely a glance, from the lead flight attendant as she breezed past row 1A without even a nod. Yem Rowe didn't flinch. She simply shifted slightly in her seat, letting her body sink into the worn leather that smelled faintly of citrus and starch. Her hands remained folded in her lap, the creases in her coat smoothed with an unconscious precision. She was still. And stillness, in a cabin full of movement, drew tension like heat draws scent. The first-class cabin had only 6 rows. 12 passengers in total, each steeped in the soft comfort of entitlement. There was the hedge fund executive flipping through spreadsheets on a matte-finished tablet, the elderly couple murmuring over their shared crossword, the woman with designer heels curled beneath her cashmere blanket. No one looked at Em. Except the crew. They didn't stare. That would have been too obvious. But they observed, measured, adjusted, the way one might when something appears out of context, not dangerous, not disruptive, just out of place. The first signal came 22 minutes into the flight. A light chime, a rolling cart, and then the question, "Would you care for a beverage, sir?" to the man in 1B. She watched as a glass of chilled Sauvignon Blanc was poured with delicate flair. Ice cubes chimed gently in the glass. The steward, a young man with a sharp jawline and overly polished shoes, turned to her next. Then he paused. His eyes darted down to a small device attached to the drink cart. The screen glowed. Something flickered across it, a notation, maybe a code. He blinked, then turned his body slightly away from her and whispered something into his collar mic. "Ma'am," he said after a beat, his tone lighter, like it had been freshly dusted in performative courtesy. "Unfortunately, we're only offering beverages to passengers with verified premium meal plans today." Yem tilted her head. "And what does that mean precisely?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It's part of our new tiered experience program. Complimentary drinks are assigned based on a combination of fare class and loyalty status." "My ticket says 1A, she replied, calm and certain. "Yes, ma'am," he nodded too quickly. "But not all 1A passengers are included." She didn't argue. She simply nodded and said, "Then no, thank you." The steward blinked again, surprised she didn't press. Then turned away, pushing the cart forward with the kind of relief that always followed a non-confrontational rejection. But Yem wasn't rejecting. She was collecting. This was the second data point. The first had happened 15 minutes earlier, when the flight attendant, Sloan, her name tag read, had handed a warm towel to each of the 3 passengers in row 2, then to 1B, then skipped her entirely with a practiced pivot of her wrist. It had been so smooth that a less perceptive person wouldn't have noticed. But EM noticed everything. The overhead lights dimmed. A hushed lull fell over the cabin as passengers settled into their curated mid-flight routines. Noise-canceling headphones activated, recliners hummed, and seatback screens flickered with curated in-flight content. Yem didn't reach for anything. Instead, she opened her coat just enough to retrieve the small leather-bound folder from her tote, placed it flat on her tray table, and began to write. She didn't write complaints. She wrote descriptions. 11:07 a.m. My contact avoidance from lead flight attendant upon entry. Towel service skipped. No acknowledgement. 11:31 a.m. Drink denied. Coded tier reference. Passenger in same row, no visible status tag, offered wine without hesitation. She closed the folder after exactly 4 lines, slid it back inside the tote, and leaned her head slightly against the cabin wall. Outside, the clouds shifted like waves below them, soft and unbothered. Inside, the plane moved toward turbulence. Not in air, but in structure. The next incident was less subtle. A passenger from row 3, middle-aged, light blazer, lanyard with what appeared to be a conference badge tucked into his front pocket, walked forward during what was supposed to be a secure phase of the flight. He didn't head to the lavatory. He stopped beside EM's seat and casually rested his forearm on the top of her headrest. "You heading to a conference too?" he asked. EM turned to him, eyes measured. "No," he smiled. "Client meeting? Or maybe you're..." He looked at her clothes as if trying to decode her function. She didn't indulge the guess. "Just traveling." The man chuckled. "Well, good for you. These seats are worth the fight these days, huh?" He straightened, then added, "They must be letting anyone up here now." He said it with a grin. Yem didn't grin back. She turned to her window and said nothing. That was the third data point. 10 minutes later, Sloan returned. This time, she knelt beside EM's seat, her posture softened into what might have passed for concern in a more sincere setting. "Ma'am," she said, "we've just received a communication from ground operations that there may have been a misalignment in our seating chart. It looks like 1A was flagged for a possible reassignment." Yem didn't respond right away. She simply raised an eyebrow. "We'd like to relocate you to 17D. It's an aisle, extra legroom, and we'd be happy to offer a complimentary voucher for your inconvenience." "What's the reason for the change?" Yem asked, voice still even. "Weight balance," Sloan answered smoothly. Yem paused, then repeated the words slowly. "Weight balance." "Yes, ma'am. Standard protocol. We're just evening out cabin distribution." Yem didn't nod. Didn't move. She looked directly at Sloan for a long second, then said, "If it's about weight, perhaps the gentleman standing in the galley for the past 6 minutes would make a more strategic shift." Sloan's mouth tightened just slightly. "I'll stay in my seat," Yem said, her tone final. Sloan hesitated, then rose and left without argument. It wasn't the refusal that stung, it was the unspoken challenge. Because Yem had done something unexpected, she had pushed back, and the system wasn't built for that. Systems like these operated best when the overlooked remained quiet, when the coded decisions went unquestioned, when silence equaled submission. But Yem's silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate. It was full. And now, it was beginning to make the crew nervous. For the next hour, nothing happened. On the surface. But behind the curtain at the front of the plane, hushed conversations began. Sloan met briefly with another crew member. The tablet was checked. A phone call was made using a secure line from the cockpit terminal. None of it was loud. But none of it was normal either. At 12:43 p.m., a junior attendant approached Yem again. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "would you mind confirming your ticket number again? There's just been some confusion." Yem nodded once, opened her phone, and handed over the boarding document. The attendant scanned it, then blinked, then scanned it again. "Thank you," he said, and walked away. He didn't return. The whispers did. A few rows back, a conversation was unfolding. "I'm telling you," someone muttered, "she's not on the list." "Then how'd she get that seat?" "I heard it was a last-minute switch. Maybe it was a glitch." Yem didn't turn around. She didn't need to. That was the fourth data point. Not the error, but the acceptance of the error. The casual ease with which people assumed her presence was the mistake. Not the behavior around her. The meal service began at 1:07 p.m. Sloane returned, this time with the tray herself. She offered cod or chicken to 1B with a smile, then paused. "Oh," she said to Yim, "I wasn't sure you were eligible. These meals are included only for ticketed premium fare holders, and yours." Yim didn't let her finish. "Mine is 1A. Confirmed, scanned, verified twice. Would you like to try again?" Sloane's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Cod or chicken?" Yim took the cod. It arrived cold. The vegetables wilted. The rice clumped. Yim didn't eat it. She wrote one more line in her leather folder, then closed it again. She had all the data she needed, and the test was far from over. The third hour of the flight began with a hum. Not the mechanical thrum of the engines, though that too was steady, but a deeper vibration, almost imperceptible, that moved through the cabin like a whisper. It wasn't sound. It was awareness. The kind of subtle shift that happens when discomfort becomes contagious. Yim hadn't moved for nearly 40 minutes. She had neither demanded service nor responded to the multiple sidelong glances tossed her way like stray pennies. But her silence, composed and unswerving, had begun to make people nervous. She had refused reassignment. She had declined a second attempt at upgrading her meal experience for a fee. She had simply remained where she was, seat 1A, a place she'd paid for, confirmed, and quietly occupied. And yet, it was clear from the way the cabin crew circled her like she might combust that her very presence was now a liability. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she hadn't done anything at all. Flight 783 from San Francisco to Charlotte wasn't full. But first class was. Every seat was taken, every one but hers occupied by someone whose lanyard, blazer, or platinum tier tag seemed to announce belonging. Except her. She wore no brand, no badge. Just the olive coat, now folded neatly in her lap, and that unwavering calm. At 1:56 p.m., Sloane returned. Not with a towel or tray this time, but with the cabin manager. "Ms. Rowe," the man began, bending slightly at the waist in a show of civility that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Bryce, lead cabin operations for this flight. I understand there's been some confusion with your profile." She didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, just enough to require effort. Bryce cleared his throat. "Our system shows some inconsistencies with your ticket source and loyalty match. For safety, we're required to validate." "My boarding pass was scanned twice," she replied, measured. "Yes, I see that. However, the back-end profile wasn't synchronized with our manifest data. That can sometimes trigger flags." "Which profile?" she asked. "The one with my name or the one with your assumptions?" Bryce blinked. "Excuse me?" "Never mind," she said softly. "Proceed." He hesitated, then took out a small scanner, held it near her phone as she reloaded her digital boarding pass. The screen turned green again. Clean. Valid. The same result it had shown the first time. He offered a tight nod. "Appreciate your cooperation." Yim didn't smile. "I haven't offered it." That was the fifth data point. Not the scan, but the shift in how they handled her. Gone was the soft indifference. Now every interaction was documented, rehearsed, sanitized. As if someone had quietly instructed, "Make it neat in case she complains." She wouldn't. Complaining would suggest she expected fairness. At 2:21 p.m., the cabin lights dimmed for scheduled descent preparations. But instead of a gentle return to routine, the space around row 1 changed once more. A second attendant passed through, distributing immigration forms to international travelers connecting beyond Charlotte. She offered one to 1B, then skipped Yim, then handed one to the woman behind her in 2A. Yim didn't say a word. She didn't need a form. She needed a pattern, and the pattern was becoming unmistakable. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering a different flight, decades ago, when she was 17 and traveling for the first time alone. That flight, too, had been quiet, but for different reasons. She had been afraid then, afraid of not knowing the rules, of speaking too softly, of misunderstanding a direction, and being seen as slow, unprepared, foreign. The woman beside her on that teenage flight had once asked, "Are you flying for work or for hope?" Yim hadn't known how to answer. This time she did. The seatbelt light pinged again. She opened her eyes and looked straight ahead. 3 minutes later, the turbulence came, not from the sky, but from the galley. A burst of voices, low and clipped, exchanged in rapid fire over the crew comms system. Sloane's voice filtered through faintly, just one phrase reaching Yim's ears. "We need to escalate if she doesn't deplane first." That was the sixth data point. It wasn't the content of the words that struck her. It was the inevitability. She hadn't made a scene. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even asked to speak to anyone. But her resistance to being repositioned, her refusal to justify her seat, her composure in the face of shrinking hospitality, it all registered not as dignity, but as threat. As the plane touched down with a soft jolt, a cold clarity settled over her. There would be someone waiting. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off. Yem remained seated. Others stood quickly, dragging suitcases from overhead compartments, chatting about rental cars and connecting flights. The man in 1B muttered something about Charlotte traffic and turned to her briefly. "You visiting family?" he asked, as if to fill the silence. "No," she replied, tone flat. "I'm visiting assumptions." He laughed once, awkwardly, not understanding. By the time the aisle began to clear, Sloane reappeared. "Ms. Rowe," she said, tone clipped, "please wait to deplane. Security will escort you." No explanation. No invitation to ask why. Just procedure. Yem nodded once, stood slowly, and reached for her tote. She didn't ask what the security escort was for. They never said detained. They never had to. It was always escort. Always verify. Always some form of just to be sure. 2 uniformed airport agents stood at the jet bridge entrance. Not police. But not neutral either. One of them, a woman in a navy vest with a tablet in her hand, gestured calmly. "Ms. Rowe, we just need a few minutes of your time." She nodded. Followed. As she stepped into the sterile brightness of the jet bridge, one of the flight attendants behind her whispered, "She's lucky she didn't get flagged before boarding." That was the 7th data point. The ease with which people agreed to suspicion. The comfort they found in justifying discomfort, as long as it wasn't theirs. They led her through a staff-only corridor, sterile and unmarked, toward a small room with pale gray walls and a single desk. Inside, a monitor, a folding chair, a badge scanner. The agent with the tablet gestured again. "Please have a seat. We just need to verify a few details." There was a travel behavior flag triggered during the flight. Yem Saturday defined how. The agent avoided her eyes. Uncooperative demeanor. Noncompliance with seating protocol. Passive-aggressive verbal cues. Yem stared at her. "Those aren't behaviors. Those are impressions." The agent looked momentarily unsure, then recovered. "We're simply following up." A second woman entered the room, mid-40s, heels, a navy blazer, and a clipped voice. "I'm Director Langley, Airport Compliance Office. MS. Rowe, this is a standard evaluation. Do you have identification?" Yem reached into her tote. Not for her ID. For the envelope. Thick. Sealed. Crimson wax with an embossed insignia. She placed it on the table between them. "This," she said, "is what triggered your flag." Langley frowned. "Excuse me? Your system detected a mismatch not because of my actions, but because of a hidden marker in your manifest. One embedded to test bias escalation." Langley hesitated. "We're not aware of any such marker." "No," Yem said, calm as always. "You wouldn't be. That's the point." Langley reached forward, but Yem tapped the envelope before her hand could make contact. "This document confirms a compliance audit initiated under protected stakeholder terms. My presence on this flight was not for leisure. It was a system test. One your team has failed multiple times." Silence followed. The hum from the overhead light seemed suddenly louder. Langley pulled her hand back. The agent shifted in her chair. Yem remained perfectly still. And somewhere in the back end of the system, the real turbulence began. Not in the air, but in the airwaves, as her signature activated a chain of alerts reaching farther than any of them were trained to handle. Chapter 3 had ended, and judgment had begun. The silence in the compliance interview room wasn't natural. It was manufactured, too tidy, too composed, the way institutions made quiet when they feared what noise might reveal. The overhead light buzzed faintly, an annoying hum that seemed louder with every breath. Director Langley sat straighter now, her earlier confidence deflating like a balloon tied too tight. Across from her, Yem Rowe hadn't moved. Her fingers rested lightly on the sealed envelope, crimson wax still unbroken, the insignia gleaming faintly beneath the sterile light. Neither woman spoke, but the air was thick with something deeper than tension. It was exposure. Langley had read the signs. Not just the ones printed on documents, but the ones she had missed until now. The composure, the non-responsiveness, the refusal to be intimidated. These weren't traits of a nervous passenger. These were traits of someone with authority. But the worst part, the truly gut-sinking part, was not realizing it sooner. "Ms. Rowe," she began again, this time with a tone that leaned heavily on the side of careful diplomacy. Perhaps we started off on the wrong foot. If there's any misunderstanding about your travel classification, I assure you, there's no misunderstanding, Yem interrupted. Not rude. Not rushed. Just final. There's documentation. You've just been trained not to see it unless it comes with a certain face. Langley hesitated. A beat passed. The agent who had led Yem into the room, Thompson, his name tag read, shifted uneasily beside the door. He hadn't said a word in minutes. Now he cleared his throat. Director, he said quietly, we have a ping from Central Records. There's an override on her profile. External audit flag, status, elevated. Langley turned sharply. Elevated how? Thompson's voice wavered. Stakeholder tier. Level 4 identification linked to the East Bridge financial oversight. Langley blinked, her carefully applied confidence cracking just slightly at the edges. She turned back to Yim, eyes a little wider. That can't be right. That's a capital entity tag. Those profiles aren't assigned to passengers. They are, Yim said, when the passenger isn't here to travel, but to observe. Langley opened her mouth again, but this time Yim reached into her tote and withdrew a second item, a black leather wallet, unbranded smooth. From within it, she removed a slim card and laid it flat on the table. Silver. Embossed. With only one line of text and a serial string beneath it. Thompson leaned forward to see it, and then leaned back even faster like it burned. The silence shifted again. This time, it wasn't quiet from discomfort. It was quiet from realization. Langley slowly reached for the envelope, and this time, Yem let her touch it. She unsealed it carefully like opening a relic, and pulled out a folded document. The texture of the paper alone said everything, thick, official, with watermark security fibers that shimmered under the fluorescent glow. Her eyes scanned the top line. Directive, Trust Verification Engagement, Unscheduled Stakeholder Presence for Behavioral System Audit. Her mouth parted slightly. Her hands trembled just once. The directive was signed, not by a middle manager or department head, but by a trust administrator with discretionary clearance to halt corporate transitions on command. She read the final clause aloud, her voice now a low thread of disbelief. And shall not be disclosed to internal operational teams unless audit behavior triggers an escalation event. Langley looked up. You were planted. No, Yem replied. I was ignored. Behind the wall, the hum of a printer suddenly started. The timing felt almost orchestrated. Langley turned to Thompson again. Who's sending prints? He looked down at his device. Incoming from Central Audit Division. It's pulling security footage. Langley's posture straightened further, almost reflexively. From where? Jetway C9, Cabin 1, and Gate 4 interactions, he said. Then added quietly, time-stamped from before boarding. Another pause. Another breath. Langley's fingers tapped against the folder now closed again. We didn't know. No one told us. I didn't need to be announced, Yem said. The point was to see how you operate when no one's watching, except the wrong person. Langley tried to gather herself. She had managed chaotic operations before, emergency reroutes, security protocol breaches, even passenger medical emergencies at 30,000 feet. But this was different. This wasn't a moment of panic. This was a moment of judgment. And the person doing the judging wore no badge, carried no clipboard, and hadn't said more than 20 sentences in 4 hours. What do you want? Langley asked. Yem didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached back into her tote and pulled out her phone. It was an older model, screen slightly scuffed at the edges. She tapped through 3 levels of encrypted access, then held it out for Langley to read. A screen blinked to life. Genesis Holdings stakeholder activation confirmed. A timestamp. A code. And beneath that, one line, audit pattern confirmation, threshold crossed. Langley sat back in her chair like she'd been pushed. This is active, she whispered. As of wheels down, Yem said. Are you reporting to the acquisition board? I don't need to. They've already received the notification. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. At that exact moment, in a glass-tinted conference room 1,700 miles away, 3 executives stared in disbelief at the blinking light on their merger dashboard. A red flag. A digital signature. A compliance delay signal that meant every term sheet, every clause, every planned public rollout was now on hold until one woman said otherwise. Back in the room, the printer behind the wall continued to spit out documentation. Langley stood suddenly, moving to the door. Thompson, she said, voice tight, get legal on the line. Quietly. And get the footage from Gate 4. I want every interaction with Ms. Rowe catalogued and time-stamped. No edits. No filters. Thompson nodded, left. Langley turned back. Ms. Rowe, I'd like to escort you to the executive lounge. Personally. Yem stared at her for a moment. Why? For your comfort, Langley said. But her eyes gave her away. Yem stood. No. You want containment. You want to move me away from the visibility. Langley didn't deny it. And that's the problem, Yem added. Visibility shouldn't be reactive. It should be inherent. The door opened again. A new face, an older man, suit without tie, hair slightly disheveled, the kind of administrative director pulled from a quiet afternoon into a very loud moment. He looked at Yem, and unlike the others, he did something no one had yet done. He bowed his head slightly. Ms. Rowe, he said, voice low, we owe you an apology. She looked at him. Then give it to your system. And make sure I'm not the only one watching next time. They walked her to the private wing of the terminal, not under escort, but in a strange kind of procession. A manager behind her. Langley beside her. Not saying anything anymore. What could they say? The real damage had already been done. Not with shouted slurs. Not with forced removals. But with skipped towels. With denied drinks. With assumptions dressed in protocol. In the executive lounge, someone had already prepared a seat, laid out water, warm towels, a folder of amenities. Too late. Yem didn't sit. She turned, looked at Langley, and handed her a final card. This is the compliance contact for Genesis's audit division. You'll be contacted within the hour. I suggest you cooperate. Because this time, silence won't protect anyone. Langley took the card with both hands. Are you going to issue a statement? I already have, Yem said, nodding toward the sealed envelope now returned to her tote. I just didn't need to say it out loud. Then she walked past them all, through the lounge, out the side corridor, and into the terminal again. No fanfare. No flash. Just a quiet woman in an olive coat, walking toward the car waiting to take her to the next meeting. Behind her, the real noise was only beginning. The hallway outside the executive lounge was quiet in the way that expensive silence always is, calculated, padded, intentional. The kind of silence built not for comfort, but for control. Yem Rowe walked through it like it belonged to her. Not with swagger, not with theatrical confidence, but with that slow, unwavering cadence of someone who had outgrown the need to justify their presence. The sealed envelope was back in her tote. Her fingers brushed it occasionally as she walked, not for reassurance, but as a reminder. The real power she carried wasn't in the paper, but in what it had exposed. At the end of the corridor, a uniformed man stepped forward, mid-30s, clean shave, eyes darting just a second too fast. Ms. Rowe, he asked, clipboard in hand. She stopped. Yes. I've been asked to escort you to your baggage. The claim process has been redirected. She didn't answer, just nodded once. He turned and led the way, and she followed. Down a narrow stairwell marked authorized staff only. Across a service hallway painted in a shade of bureaucratic beige, into a small room labeled claims restricted. There, behind a metal desk, stood a woman in a blazer 3 sizes too stiff and a name badge that said A. Wexler Supervisor, Terminal Logistics. Ms. Rowe, Wexler said before even offering a seat. Your checked item was pulled for verification after landing, due to an internal reclassification code attached to your itinerary. We've logged it as an override item under flag status 19C. That's not a random code, Yem said calmly. That's a behavioral flag, one used for silent escalation without triggering public documentation. Wexler blinked. Behind her, the agent cleared his throat. We didn't realize that at first, ma'am. No, Yem said. You weren't supposed to. Wexler gestured stiffly to the metal bin in the corner. Your item is there. We logged it as unverified, due to lack of baggage match at arrival. I assure you, no contents have been removed. Yem crossed the room. The tote sat on top of a dull silver container, a yellow tag looped through one strap. Non-matching manifest item. Secondary inspection advised. The zipper was half open. Her eyes narrowed. She picked it up. It felt lighter. At the desk, she unzipped it fully. The leather folder was still there, the documents intact. But something had changed. Not missing, just touched. Disturbed. The seal on the secondary envelope, the one marked for emergency override contact, had been lifted and pressed back down. Not torn. Not broken. but carefully peeled. A fingerprint was smudged on the wax. "Who opened this?" she asked, her voice low. I don't know," Wexler said. "It may have been an automatic process." "Stop," Yem said, and the woman did. Instantly, Yem closed the bag. "Where's your supervisor?" I'm the senior on site. I meant the one who signed off on the flag." There was a pause. Then Wexler said, "Eric Dempsey, Terminal Security Liaison. Bring him." Wexler nodded and moved quickly out of the room. The agent didn't meet her eyes. Yem sat. She didn't need to pace. That wasn't her power. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. When the door finally opened, Dempsey entered like a man trying to look more composed than he felt. His badge shone. His blazer was crisp. His smile was cautious. "Ms. Rowe," he said, extending a hand. She didn't take it. "You authorized a search on a flagged item belonging to a first-class passenger under federal compliance protection," she said without preamble. "Do you deny that?" He hesitated. "We followed protocol. The behavioral flag was submitted via post-arrival report by flight crew. You were logged as measured, non-compliant, and resistant to seat reassignment. That meets the criteria for discretionary suspicion," she finished, "which gives you the cover to open anything that belongs to someone who refuses to yield." His lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not how we define it." "No," she said, "but that's exactly how you use it." He didn't answer. Yem opened her tote again and removed the smaller envelope, the one with the peeled seal. She placed it on the desk between them. "This," she said, "wasn't yours to touch." He reached for it. She stopped him with a look. Then she placed her hand flat on the envelope and slid it back into the bag. "I want a full report," she said. "Time of access, name of handler, digital log of movement, and a video pull from this room from the last 90 minutes. That'll require clearance." "You already had it," she said. "You just didn't know who you were clearing." He paused, then nodded. "You'll have it." "No," she said. "You will gather it, then present it, in person, to the Genesis Oversight Liaison assigned to this incident." His eyes widened. "You're activating the financial board?" he asked. "I don't need to," she replied. "They've already received the data trail. You're already in the system." Dempsey looked down, the weight of the moment finally setting in. Outside the door, the hallway had grown louder, subtle signs of motion, of admin scrambling, of people realizing something had shifted. Not because someone yelled, but because someone didn't. Yem rose. As she stepped out of the room, 2 airport officials were already approaching, their pace urgent but controlled. One of them, young, headset clipped to his ear, face pale, whispered into his mic as he walked. His eyes flicked to Yem and then away quickly. She heard just enough of the whisper to understand. She's walking through now. Initiate the freeze. She continued forward, past baggage claims, past the high windows of the terminal. Up ahead, a group of staff members huddled by Gate B9, their faces tense. A woman among them held a printed memo in her hands. At the top, bold font, Stakeholder Incident Escalation Category 3 Compliance Risk. The memo was already outdated. The risk wasn't just Category 3 anymore. It was foundational. Because by now, the audit system she'd triggered had started crawling backwards, tracing patterns of passenger treatment across months, even years. And every profile matched that echoed hers, older women, no status tags, solo travelers in premium seats, were being reviewed for anomalies. Every skipped row, every denied drink, every unfiled smile. She walked past them all, her tote secure, her coat draped over one arm. The air in the terminal felt cooler now, crisper. Not because the temperature had changed, but because the climate had. When she reached the escalator, she paused for just a second. A small boy, no older than 6, was standing at the top with his mother. He stared at her, not rudely, just curiously. His mother reached for his hand, as if to gently steer him away, but the boy didn't move. He just whispered, "Is she important?" His mother bent down and whispered something back. But Yem didn't need to hear it. She already knew the answer. She stepped onto the escalator, descending slowly, the sounds of the terminal fading behind her. Above, somewhere in the admin wing, an alert pinged on the personal device of Havenport's legal director. It read, "Audit Escalation, Level 4 Compliance Stakeholder Active Incident Code. Row Indigo delay all merger-based signatures until verified resolution." The countdown had begun. And she hadn't even opened her mouth. By the time Yem Rowe stepped into the VIP transport vehicle arranged under Terminal Compliance Code, the airport had already begun to shake, internally quietly but undeniably. The car that waited for her wasn't a limousine. It wasn't flashy or armored. It was a sleek black sedan, nondescript in every way except for the digital display on the console dashboard, authorized for Tier 4 stakeholder routing Genesis Holdings audit track. She didn't look at the driver. Didn't need to. He was just a link in the chain. The door shut behind her with a soft click, and within seconds the vehicle pulled away from the loading bay, bypassing standard traffic lanes with clearance codes that only a handful of entities could activate. Outside the tinted windows, the airport continued its illusion of order, passengers wheeling luggage, staff giving directions, gate announcements echoing overhead. But behind that glass, the illusion had cracked. Inside the sedan, she pulled out her secure terminal, smaller than a laptop, heavier than a phone, and pressed her thumb against the biometric sensor. The interface lit up, soft green. The Genesis audit dashboard opened like the petals of a mechanical flower. She was no longer just a passenger. She was now the signal. Her activation had triggered a data web that unfurled across the airline's internal systems like a neural net scanning for patterns. In real time, a map of escalated incidents bloomed across her screen, flagged passengers with behavior markers that mirrored hers, analyzed not by name but by profile indicators, age, gender, absence of status tags, first-time premium travelers. And beneath each case was a link, unresolved, silent, forgotten, until now. Her finger tapped a cluster near Chicago O'Hare, another at Atlanta Hartsfield. A dozen more pulsed red across secondary hubs. All had one thing in common: passengers who had been quietly repositioned, dismissed, flagged for reassignment without formal complaint or investigation. Not for what they did, but for how they looked doing it. Yem leaned back in her seat and let the screen glow against her face. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Sloane Carter was being pulled mid-shift from her next assigned flight. She had barely changed into her standard Navy uniform for a Milwaukee connector when a floor manager approached her at gate C5. "Come with me," he said, voice tight. "Now," she blinked, holding her tablet. "Now." No explanation. No accusation. Just that same antiseptic tone she'd used herself so many times before, on passengers who didn't quite fit. In the operations room, she was handed a printed memo. It was short, brutal in its efficiency. "Pending internal review, you are temporarily relieved of all premium tier assignments." The words sounded vague, pending, temporary review, but the message was unmistakable. First class was off limits. International rotations suspended. Effective immediately. She stared at the paper and tried to breathe through it. Behind her, Trent Maxwell, the gate agent who had rerouted Yem at check-in, was pacing. His login credentials had been suspended within minutes of the audit systems synced to the Genesis Oversight Division. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered, as if repetition might convert the fact into a defense. "That's the point," his supervisor replied flatly. "You shouldn't have needed to." At the same time, in a frosted glass boardroom on the third floor of Havenport's headquarters, an emergency meeting was underway. The CFO, legal director, and chief of customer integrity sat around a sleek black table, their devices buzzing, a red message bar scrolling across their shared dashboard. Stakeholder tier alert row activation compliance level 4. "What the hell is a row activation?" the CFO asked, eyes sharp. The legal director didn't look up from his tablet. "It's not a protocol. It's a person." Meaning she's the discretionary verifier tied to our Genesis merger clause. She's the one person, the one, who can suspend compliance clearance. The CFO leaned back, tension coiling in his shoulders. "And she was on one of our flights today?" "Yes." "In first class?" "No," the legal director looked up now. "She was tested in first class." Back in the sedan, Yem watched the compliance logs update. She wasn't interested in apologies. Not yet. She was interested in patterns. For too long, the systems had hidden behind ambiguity. Standard protocol. Random check. Eligibility status mismatch. But every skipped towel, every cold meal, every doubting glance, they weren't random. They were decisions. Made quietly. Repeated confidently. Because there were never consequences. Until now. Her car pulled into a secure entrance at a nearby business complex owned by Eastbridge Financial Holdings. A private elevator opened as she stepped inside. No button panel, no prompt. The elevator rose without instruction, stopping on a floor marked only by a single plaque. Governance and audit private stakeholder access, only a glass wall parted as she approached, revealing a small boardroom already prepared. 3 compliance officers stood waiting. A digital screen displayed live footage from the airport's internal channels, Sloan standing motionless in the operations room. Trent arguing with someone in HR. A supervisor reading through an incident report with mounting disbelief. Yem placed her tote on the polished table and removed 2 envelopes, one red sealed, the other black. She placed them side by side. "I want full transcript documentation," she said. "Every employee who interacted with me. Time-stamped. Cross-referenced. And I want it mirrored against your onboarding modules for bias detection." One of the officers nodded. "Already in progress. The AI is flagging language patterns now. Include gesture analysis. Facial response during service. Gait hesitation. Audio hesitation. Understood." She took a breath, then added, "And I want cross-review of all service disruptions in first class over the past 24 months where the passenger was demographically aligned to my profile." That made them pause. It was a massive request. It wasn't just punitive, it was foundational. A structural mirror. "Ma'am," one of them said carefully, "this could trigger escalations to HR policy frameworks and force recertification of over 400 staff members." Yem looked up. "Good." Outside the room, the air smelled faintly of industrial sterility. But inside, it had begun to smell like something else, reckoning. She didn't speak again for several minutes. Just watched the feed. Watched as Sloan sat down. As Trent rubbed his face and looked for an exit that didn't exist. As a senior director in another terminal office slowly realized his entire regional division would be placed under external audit by morning. It had taken 1 flight, 1 seat, 1 silent woman in an olive coat. But the echo of her presence now rippled through every corridor of the company. She closed her screen and stood. She had no intention of issuing a press statement. She didn't need to. The system was already speaking for her to itself. And it wasn't whispering anymore. Somewhere, in the subterranean levels of the airport's administrative wing, the lights never turned off. The walls didn't know daylight, and the floors carried the weight of unspoken things. Footsteps that quickened when procedures failed. Documents that moved in sealed folders with no traceable digital twin. Conversations spoken just low enough to avoid microphones. It was here, in a closed-door conference room labeled Ops 6A, that everything began to collapse. The cabin crew of Flight 783 was called in without ceremony. Sloan sat with her arms crossed, her uniform immaculate, but her expression fractured in a way only she could feel. Because this time, it wasn't a passenger sitting in silent discomfort. It was her. Trent Maxwell, the gate agent who had rerouted Yem at check-in, slouched beside her, the bravado from earlier replaced with visible restraint. The room was quiet except for the soft shuffle of printed reports being distributed. Each file bore the same watermark. Genesis Financial Holdings Internal Audit Review Class B Incident Protocol. They all knew what that meant. Class B wasn't about luggage misplacement or overbookings. It was about ethics, culture, behavior. The kind of things that couldn't be excused with a customer service smile or swept under procedural carpet. A woman entered then, tall, broad-shouldered, her navy blazer devoid of any emotion or frills. Her name tag read L. Halverson Personnel Ethics Division. She didn't sit. She didn't clear her throat. She just began. "You are here because someone in this room made a choice." She looked at no one, and at everyone. A choice to categorize a passenger not based on action, but on appearance. A choice to override a legitimate boarding pass. A choice to delay service. A choice to write a report vague enough to conceal bias, but clear enough to initiate escalation. And those choices have consequences. Sloan straightened. "We followed protocol." She refused reassignment. "We flagged it for follow-up." Halverson didn't blink. "No. You presumed inconvenience equaled noncompliance. And then you used that assumption to rewrite reality." A screen behind her flickered to life. Playback began. Yem standing silently as she handed over her boarding pass. The scan confirming seat 1A. No confusion. No confrontation. Just the gate agent's hesitation. Another clip. Sloan passing over her during towel service. The tray missing her row during drinks. Each time stamped. Each mapped to service manifest records that conveniently left her out. Halverson let the silence after the clip speak louder than her voice ever could. "What you're watching," she said, "is not accidental. It is pattern behavior. And it matches over 24 prior incidents across 6 airports." A low breath caught in Trent's throat. We didn't know who she was. Exactly, Halverson replied. And that's the problem. You treated her poorly because you thought she was no one. Because your standard of professionalism is conditional. Sloane looked away. Another clip played. Cabin footage. A male passenger from row 3 leaning over Yem's seat, speaking to Sloane. She's in first? And Sloane's laugh. Quiet. Not quite quiet enough. Must be a redemption ticket or something. The audio stung. Not because it was cruel, but because it was casual. Unthinking. The kind of prejudice that doesn't shout, but assumes. You created a story, Halverson continued. You filled in blanks that weren't yours to fill. And now that story is being told back to you, by a system that sees what you didn't. She paced the front of the room slowly, letting the words settle. The passenger you profiled was not just any traveler. She is the sole signatory holding discretionary override for a multi-billion-dollar merger. Her name sits in an encrypted trust registry, known to no more than 12 individuals in the industry. Until today. The weight hit then. Like a dropped stone in a still pond. Sloane tried to recover. So she tricked us? She came undercover? She came unseen, Halverson said. There's a difference. In the back of the room, an IT analyst whispered into Halverson's ear, then handed her a tablet. She scanned it once, twice, then looked up. Effective immediately, she said, her voice devoid of judgment. Trent Maxwell is suspended pending full investigation. Your gate activity log shows you intentionally diverted the passenger despite a clean scan. That alone justifies audit action. Trent opened his mouth but closed it again. Sloane Carter, Halverson continued, your service record, audio communications, and flight logs are being forwarded to Ethics Council. Until review, you are removed from all international and premium class assignments. Your remaining routes will be restricted to domestic low-priority segments. Sloane's breath caught. Not quite a sob, but something like it. This isn't discipline, Halverson said. This is accountability. She turned to the screen again, and the final clip played, Yem post-flight, being quietly ushered away. Not handcuffed. Not detained. Just flagged. Because she had not accepted the treatment in silence. Because her refusal to be diminished had made them uncomfortable. And now the system was finally uncomfortable too. Hours later, the internal memo went out across the airline's operational database. Subject: Operational realignment, immediate reassignment of Flight 783 crew. It didn't name names. But the list was clear. Every crew member was being reassigned to regional rotations. No first-class cabins. No platinum passengers. No proximity to stakeholders. The footnote was short. This reassignment reflects a necessary review of passenger treatment protocols, pending outcome of the Genesis compliance audit. At first glance, it looked like just another staffing note. But those reading it knew better. It was a fall. Not dramatic. Not loud. But complete. Meanwhile, Yem sat in a private observation room overlooking the city's skyline. The glass before her was tinted. But the world outside glimmered as if aware something had shifted. On her terminal, a notification blinked. Interim audit response approved. Review cycle initiated. She tapped once. Then again. With each confirmation, a new policy review was queued. Flight crew behavioral tracking protocols. Escalation justification logs. Passenger profiling patterns. This wasn't revenge. It was a recalibration. She didn't want an apology. She didn't want a banner hung or her name etched in some internal lessons learned document. She wanted the mirror to stay. Because the people who had ignored her didn't need to remember her. They needed to remember themselves. And now, every time they reached for a towel tray or glanced at a boarding pass, the question would live in their hands. Am I serving fairly? Or just serving who I expect to see? At precisely 9:42 a.m. the following morning, a digital memo reached the inboxes of every regional vice president at Havenport Air. The subject line was clinical, almost forgettable. Finalization of stakeholder review authorization pending signature. But the impact of that message was immediate and absolute. Executives who had confidently brushed off yesterday's alerts as overblown internal noise were now staring at their screens in dawning horror. Because attached to the memo was a single sentence from Genesis Holdings. Stakeholder Yem Rowe has elected to defer final authorization of the merger until further internal reforms are enacted and independently verified. No drama. No scolding. Just the kind of sentence that destroys quarters, unravels strategies, and makes boardrooms bleed. Silence, weaponized not through anger but through timing. In an office 20 stories above street level, Leonard Westbrook, Director of Strategic Affairs at Havenport, stood with his phone pressed tight to his ear, jaw locked, as someone from Genesis's compliance division calmly explained that all discretionary leverage now resided with a woman they hadn't even noticed until it was too late. The person on the other end didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to, because power, when real, rarely requires volume. Downstairs, inside the glass and steel terminal, the day appeared to unfold like any other. Passengers wheeled suitcases across gleaming tiles. Children clutched juice boxes. Gate announcements rang out in chipper voices, all carefully curated for calm. But beneath it all, an invisible current had shifted. Word had spread, not to the public, not in any press release, but through the tight-knit threads of internal networks, whispered between department heads and risk officers. They were calling it the Roe effect, not because of a scandal, but because of a reckoning. Yem sat quietly in a reserved office at Genesis HQ, tucked into a room so simple it felt almost monastic. White walls, a longwood table, a single frosted window. On the table before her sat a sleek terminal. She had not logged in yet. She was waiting. Behind her, an assistant hovered near the door, respectfully silent but visibly tense. Finally, the assistant cleared their throat. "They've requested a meeting. Full executive board. In person." Yem didn't turn. "Of course they have. Do you wish to proceed with the delay?" She considered that, then slowly turned toward the assistant. "Let them wait 20 more minutes." "Understood." She returned to the screen. The cursor blinked on the authorization page, a single prompt awaiting her biometric approval. But the cursor was not impatient. Neither was she. Meanwhile, across terminals in multiple cities, a parallel story was unfolding. Sloan Carter, former senior flight attendant of Flight 783, now stood at Gate D3 in a modest domestic wing of the airport. Her uniform still fit the same. Her posture was still polished. But everything about her aura had changed. There was no longer the quiet superiority she once wore like perfume. There was only the stark weight of awareness. That someone she had dismissed had not only seen everything, but remembered. Her schedule now included back-to-back flights to mid-tier cities. No international layovers. No first-class cabins. And certainly, no interactions with stakeholders. She read the internal memo that morning with hands that barely shook. It was titled Behavioral Reassignment Review, Tier 1 Personnel. The description wasn't punitive, at least not outwardly. It spoke of opportunity for cultural reevaluation and proximity-based service recalibration. But the real meaning was simple. You are no longer trusted where reputation matters most. The same memo had reached Trent Maxwell, who now sat in the HR interview room with a representative from the union, answering questions about discretionary passenger reroutes and undocumented overrides. Trent had spent years learning how to manage traffic, navigate double bookings, soothe the occasional irate traveler. But none of that had prepared him for the accusation that now hung in the air like smoke. "How many times have you reassigned a seat based on appearance?" He didn't have an answer. Not because he was lying, but because he'd never thought to count. Elsewhere, behind closed doors, a meeting had begun. Yem entered without announcement. A dozen executives stood, not out of courtesy but out of fear. She didn't wave, didn't nod. She simply walked to the table, placed a thin folder on the center surface, and opened it. Inside, a list of policy directives, each marked with a blue stamp. Behavioral review modules. Expanded bias training. AI audit transparency. Passenger interaction logging with facial recognition-based analysis for selective service tracking. One of the board members finally found his voice. "Ms. Rowe, these changes there." "Yes," she said. "Costly," he finished. "Not as costly as arrogance." There was a long pause. "We didn't mean—" "I know," she interrupted. "That's the most dangerous part. You never meant to. You just did it anyway. Because it was easy. Because no one was watching. Because you thought power looked like something else." She tapped the document once. "This isn't punishment. It's opportunity. The next time someone like me walks into your cabin, I want your team to think about the possibility that they are not being tested, but being remembered." Another silence. This one respectful. She stood. "You have my signature," she said. "But you also have my memory." And then she left. No drama. No cameras. Just consequence. Later that day, as she passed through the terminal once more, not to fly, but simply to observe, she noticed how the air around her felt different. The gate agents were standing straighter. The flight attendants moving with more intention. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Systems don't change overnight, but sometimes they start to remember. She stopped for coffee at a small kiosk near gate E12. The woman behind the counter smiled. Not perfunctory, not robotic, just real. Would you like a receipt, ma'am? She asked. Yem smiled. No need. She walked toward the window and watched the runway. Planes lifting off like birds finding sky. In her bag, the terminal buzzed once, signature received, merger reactivated under revised governance. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. The signature wasn't the victory. The change was. And this time, it wasn't in the sky. It was on the ground, where it always starts.